My name is Julia Kim, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Calgary. My presentation is one of 4 in the symposium titled, How Can We Assess Subjective Experiences and Internal Representations in the Brain? In my presentation, I'll be talking about the neural representations of internally oriented cognition. I'll first introduce the topic of internally oriented cognition. Next, I'll discuss methodological approaches that are commonly used to assess these subjective experiences. And finally, in the third part, I'll discuss a series of studies that apply these approaches to reveal the neural basis of internally oriented cognition. First, some background. Within the context of this talk, I refer to internally oriented cognition as mental processes that are unrelated to and unprompted by external stimuli. In contrast with externally oriented cognition, such as perceptive and motor processes. One classic example of this distinction between externally and internally processes lies in selective attention. For example, during externally oriented cognition, this would correspond to putting the spotlight of attention onto something in the external environment. In contrast, if we turn that spotlight inwards towards our own thoughts that are unrelated to the external environment, that would classify as internally oriented cognition. Importantly, these internally oriented cognitive processes take up a notable portion of our awake hours. Not only that, it also has a huge impact on our everyday functions. For example, on one hand, it facilitates the generation of creative solutions to problems, and it also facilitates future planning, such as making plans for the weekend. On the other hand, it's been shown to disrupt performance, especially when it happens during a task, and it's also been linked to clinical symptoms. So despite how prevalent internally oriented cognition is and the impact it has on our everyday functions, we've only started to gain a better understanding in the last couple of decades of these phenomenological experiences and its neural underpinnings. But before delving into the neural basis of these experiences, let's first go over some reliable measures of internally oriented cognition. In many areas of cognitive neuroscience, objective measures are the gold standard. However, given internally oriented cognition reflect subjectively experienced covert mental states, the measures that we typically rely on, such as behavioral performance, would not optimally capture these subjective experiences with varying phenomenological features that inherently has no behavioral correlates. Therefore, in the context of internal representations and subjective experiences, subjective measures are considered the gold standard. Now, whereas with behavioral or neural measures, we can only infer the underlying mental process, subjective measures provide a direct measurement of one's covert phenomenological experience because it requires participants to introspect. In other words, subjective measures ask that participants attend to their own phenomenological experience. Now, despite this utility, subjective measures are not widely accepted as an optimal measure, perhaps because of potential measurement errors, for example, resulting from demand characteristics or an inability to accurately introspect. Importantly, just as measurement errors exist in objective measures and methods have been developed to address these errors, studies have also established evidence for the reliability and validity for these subjective measures. An important distinction that highlights the validity of subjective measures lies in the content-based introspection versus the interpretation-based introspection. Content-based introspection involves simply gaining access to the content of one's subjective experience. For example, if I ask you, what are you thinking about right now? We're generally quite capable of doing that accurately. In contrast, interpretation-based introspection involves speculating the reasons for our actions, which is less corroborated by empirical evidence. In a recent paper led by Gonzalez-Castillo, we argue that content-based introspection is critical for accessing the phenomenological experiences of our ongoing thoughts. Now, while various subjective measures exist, I will focus on 2 in this talk that's most relevant to internally oriented cognition. One of the most commonly used approach is experience sampling. This involves the sampling of one's inner experience in the moment. Typically, at pseudo-random intervals throughout a task, multiple thought probes such as this one are repeatedly presented that ask participants to report the focus of their attention or the content of their thoughts, and so on in that moment. A similar approach also asks participants to report their internally oriented cognition, but instead of doing it multiple times throughout a task, these post-task questions entail a retrospective report that is elicited after the completion of the task. It may ask a question such as this: during the task, how often were your thoughts focused on the task? These approaches are useful for revealing subjective experiences and internal representations, but since they are subjective nonetheless, we need to verify them, and for that, we turn to additional measures. And this brings me to the notion of triangulation, first introduced by Johnny Smallwood and Jonathan Schooler. This refers to the notion that we can infer mental processes, in this case, internally oriented cognition, based on a combination of subjective measures, neural measures, and behavioral measures. In other words, by combining subjective measures, which provide a direct measure of one's subjective experience, and objective measures, which provide an assessment that is unlikely to be influenced by demand characteristics or inaccurate reports, we can identify the variance that's common to these measures in order to make inferences about the underlying cognitive state. And this can be applied to a combination of many different types of measures. As an example, a study may combine the experience sampling approach with EEG. And in this case, each experience sampling report provides a glimpse of one's ongoing mental experiences in the moment during a task. So let's say if we want to know what's going on in the brain of someone who's focusing on the task as indicated by this icon here, and not focusing on the task as indexed by these icons here, we can examine the EEG activity and behavioral performance during these periods, comparing the on-task periods to the off-task periods. As another example, a study may combine post-task questions with fMRI. So let's say in the same task with the same participant with the same mental experiences, instead of knowing when exactly each of these thoughts occurred, the participant may report at the conclusion of the task that they spent about 1/3 of their time focusing on the task and the other 2/3 of the time not focusing on the task. We can then see which activation patterns in the brain correspond with this retrospective report of one's overall subjective experience across the entire task duration. All right, now with these approaches in mind, I will now discuss a series of studies that applied these combinations of measures to reveal the neural representation of internally oriented cognition. Specifically, with the focus on experience sampling as subjective measures and EEG as neural measures, we will discuss several types of internally oriented cognition. One of the most commonly studied forms of internally oriented cognition is task-unrelated thoughts. As the name suggests, these are thoughts that are unrelated to the ongoing experimental task, typically measured in a lab setting. And using a combination of experience sampling and EEG, my lab, along with other labs, have established the electrophysiological signatures of task-unrelated thought. One of the most reliable index of task-unrelated thought is a reduced stimulus-evoked P3 ERP component, as indexed by these teal-colored lines during task-unrelated thoughts, compared to this gray line here indicating on-task thoughts. In other words, our response to an experimental task stimuli is attenuated when we're not paying attention to the task at hand compared to when we do pay attention to the task at hand. Another reliable measure is increased alpha activity. And this is particularly the case when the task-unrelated thought, or just thoughts in general, are internally oriented. And this is shown by this yellow blob here in the alpha range around 8 to 14 Hertz during task-unrelated thought that is greater compared to the alpha activity shown here during on-task thoughts. Now, given the alpha activity occurred during a time window that is beyond the stimulus-evoked activity time window, this suggests that alpha activity may serve as an index of task-unrelated thought itself. Our recent systematic review on the electrophysiological signatures of task-unrelated thought also revealed similar patterns of findings, such as these ones shown here, across existing studies that also used experience sampling and EEG. Now, why do we care about EEG signatures of task-unrelated thought? One of the primary practical application of understanding the EEG correlates of task and related thoughts is that they can actually inform the optimal EEG features that can be used for detecting task and related thoughts using machine learning approaches. To that end, our proof of concept study a few years back used EEG features such as the N1 and P3 ERP components to predict the occurrence of task and related thoughts. We examined two performance metrics. For the area under the curve, or AUC metric, the chance level is 0.5, and for the Matthews correlation coefficient, or MCC metric, chance level is 0. And as shown here in the person-dependent model, for both the SVM and the logistic regression models, we see that classification is above chance in both the AUC measures and the MCC measures. For the person-independent model, classification performance is still also above chance, but rather modest, but still comparable to existing studies in this area. These results with the person-independent model is particularly striking because they suggest that it's possible to detect task-unrelated thought using EEG features without having any prior information about that person. And they underscore the potential for generalizable machine learning models that can classify task-unrelated thoughts in real time using electrophysiological measures. Now, in addition to the common EEG measures that we talked about, such as ERP and spectral power, we recently explored an under-examined measure in EEG, that is brain signal complexity, which reflects the degree to which the brain is flexible to switch between possible states and, in the context of fMRI, functional configurations. For example, greater complexity has been observed during rest periods, potentially suggesting that the brain was in this preparation mode to better explore different brain states. We measured brain signal complexity using multi-scale entropy. This measure captures the flexibility of the EEG signal at varying timescales. Now, complexity at finer timescales indicates processing within local regions, whereas coarser timescales indicates flexibility across distal regions. And in combining experience sampling and this brain signal complexity measure of EEG, we found that brain signal complexity was increased at coarse timescales, as shown by these orange bars, colored bars here, mostly over anterior and posterior channels. And here in the horizontal bar indicates the time scale. So on the left here, it ranges from finer time scale all the way to coarser time scale on the right, as indicated within each electrode site. And so this suggests that task-unrelated thought can be characterized by increased flexibility to switch between different brain states across distal regions spanning anterior and posterior sites. These results suggest that task-unrelated thoughts are linked to the ongoing dynamic properties of the brain. While task-unrelated thought reveals when one is not paying attention to an ongoing task, it doesn't reveal the phenomenological aspects of those thoughts. So having mapped out some of the robust electrophysiological patterns of task-unrelated thought, we started to explore the phenomenological features of our ongoing internally oriented thoughts. One feature that has gained quite a bit of traction in recent years is the dynamics of our thoughts. In other words, thoughts that freely move from one topic to another or truly wander with no overarching direction or any type of constraints. Again, in combining experience sampling with EEG, we found that alpha power, as shown here by this yellow patch, over frontal sites were significantly increased during these freely moving thoughts compared to non-freely moving thoughts, as shown here. This is consistent with past findings that have implicated frontal alpha activity in creative processes, suggesting that this frontal alpha marker may be generally involved in these sort of divergent thought processes. Thus far, we've discussed results from studies using scalp EEG. Now, one limitation of this approach is a relatively low spatial resolution. So in order to better understand how the brain supports internally oriented cognition, it's useful to know which areas generated the signal and how these different areas work together. For that, we turn to intracranial EEG, which provides the temporal and spatial precision to reveal the neural mechanism underlying internally oriented cognition. In this particular study, we focus on internal attention as a type of internally oriented cognition. Specifically, we measured EEG activity through intracranial electrodes implanted in regions within 2 large-scale networks. The default mode network, or DMN, as shown in the red dots, and the frontal parietal control network, or FPCN, as shown in the 2 shades of blue dots. The DMN is involved in internally oriented processes, whereas the FPCN is involved in high-level cognitive control processes. And it's also been parcellated into 2 subsystems. For the purpose of our talk, we're going to refer to it as internal control network, which is shown in the dark blue dots, and external control network, which is shown in the light blue dots. Now, past fMRI studies have shown that the DMN is strongly correlated with the FPCN internal control network. What we don't know is the underlying electrophysiological basis of this connectivity pattern, which may be a potential candidate for the mechanism supporting internal attention. To test this, we examined the connectivity between the DMN and the FPCN internal control network in the theta band, which has been implicated in attentional control processes. We found that theta band connectivity between the DMN and the FPCN internal control network was significantly greater during internal attention relative to external attention. Now, this was not observed for the connectivity between the DMN and the FPCN external control network. Importantly, we found that this metric of theta band connectivity to be significantly correlated with the post-task report of the frequency with which participants engage in internal attention, giving functional significance to this theta connectivity metric between networks. These findings suggest that the functional connectivity in the theta band between the default mode network and the frontal parietal control network, especially the internal control network, is one mechanism underlying internal attention. Taken together, this combination of well-validated subjective measures and well-established neural and behavioral measures can reveal the neural basis of internally oriented cognition. These findings have 2 implications. First, from a basic science perspective, it can help develop a mechanistic model of how the brain supports internally oriented cognition. And from a translational science perspective, these findings can facilitate the development of machine learning models that can be used to predict these subjective mental states eventually in real time and in everyday life. Thank you for your attention, and I also like to thank all my collaborators who made important contributions to the work presented in this talk. Now, if you're searching for a postdoc position and find our work interesting, please consider joining our team. The details of the position can be found on our lab website.